without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today. We're really, really lucky to have Etienne Maynier with us today. So Etienne is an activist, hacker, and security researcher from Toulouse, France, currently working. Can I say where you're currently working?
Yeah, I'm actually not working there anymore, but I've been working at Amnesty International.
Okay, so was working with Amnesty International. His work focuses on researching how states are using digital surveillance against civil society. He has been studying spyware and phishing attacks against NGOs, journalists, and human rights defenders for more than 6 years. And he's been involved in several publications, such as work on the Pegasus Project. And he's also an active member of the Echap, nonprofit organization, which fights against digital surveillance and intimate partner violence. So we're really, really lucky to have Etienne with us today.
Well, it's pretty impressive to have someone who is introducing me and all that. It's just Wilson. And I've been talking with a lot of you. It has been quite humbling to be part of all this discussion. I feel a bit weird coming from Europe, and also a large part of my talk, we won't talk specifically about North America, but I think a lot of things applies. There is not much to add. I've been working as of last week. I was working for Amnesty International. So I'm going to speak mostly about the experience I've had there, but I've been working for 6-7 years on understanding attacks against human rights defenders, mostly spyware and phishing attacks. I'm going to talk mostly about that, but I've tried to make a talk that's broader about digital surveillance, what the problem with digital surveillance, how to counter it, give some example, and then I will go into the one thing that I've worked on, which is Pegasus spyware and spyware issue in general. Quick disclaimer. I'm not working for Amnesty International anymore, and this talk is my own thinking and my own version of the digital surveillance issue. Don't take this as me speaking for any organization. And second disclaimer, I am here speaking, but again, all the work I'm talking about is group work, so it's always often one person speaking, but don't take this as one person doing the work. It's been quite a big teamwork, especially on the Pegasus Project. So what about digital surveillance? So this is the creepy moment I've called it. It's so let's talk about digital surveillance. You wake up in the morning, because most people, you may switch on your phone, and then pretty quickly, the first thing you do, if you switch off your phone, but let's say you do, is you have to put your PIN code, and suddenly your phone is able to connect to the phone network through the SIM card. And that by design is actually what it's doing, is that the network needs to geolocate where your phone is, because you connect to the closest antenna. And so your telecom provider knows where you are by design of this. And this was super great when smartphone and a mobile phone arrived, but actually what it creates is the capacity for a company to know pretty much where you are all the time. And this has been used very regularly for instance, the police to track people. Sometimes when people disappear, the last information we have is when was the last connection of the mobile phone. Also to track activists or whatever criminal investigation it is. Companies also using this geolocation data. We'll talk about this a bit more. So that's the first I just want to have a phone call with my mom, and boom, you're already actually surveilled. Then you need to have internet or want to connect your speaker. So you have this short range connection like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And this is awesome. You can access internet through Wi-Fi most of the time. Bluetooth is used mostly for speakers, but I don't know what you all do. It can be very different things. And again, this short-range connection are really great, but actually some companies were what if we use that for tracking? And so, for instance, companies have trackers mostly in malls and commercial places, because what your phone is doing when Wi-Fi or Bluetooth is enabled is that it's always trying to find who is nearby to connect, right? Your phone connects automatically to the speaker, and so by design, it's always checking, is there a speaker around? And companies have been developing systems that you have in commercial areas, and they will track your phone to try to make behavior and pattern of behavior of who is coming to commercial areas. And of course, they sell that to stores, so they have an idea of who is coming. So that's for the communication. And now we get on the system. You have an operating system, which is kind of the core of the system, often Android for Android phones and iOS for iPhones. It's kind of the layer that organizes everything else, as you may know. And it looks awesome, but it's very hard to know exactly what's happening in the system. We know that Android has been gathering a lot of information about people. You also have an online account, like a cloud account, Google or iCloud. and you can save your data there, which is awesome, but it's actually very hard to know what you save or not. For instance, Google is saving your Wi-Fi password, which is great. You can find your Wi-Fi password on other systems, but that means it's also shared with your Google accounts. And so you get into this very connected phone, and it's very hard to know exactly what data you're sharing or not. And then as everyone, you start installing applications and you want to order food or like just like know where you are. And these applications have some permission, as you all may know. You can control them, but it's actually quite hard to know what the applications are doing. Like many applications need to have your geolocation because it's a map, but is it using it for anything else? And that's actually very hard to know. And even worse, a lot of applications rely on third-party tools for a lot of reasons. It could be to track who's using the app, could be to help finding issues in the app. And it's even harder to know what these third-party applications are doing. So for instance, in the work we did in 2021 with Amnesty International, we analyzed a contact tracing application. And we found that an app developed by a government in the Middle East, which one was gathering geolocation of people. And our understanding was the developer never wanted that, but they used a third-party tool that was doing that by default, and they never thought about checking the configuration. So you get into this completely like very complex system with like very complex operating system, very complex application, and complete lack of control. And that's kind of the starting of like situation we have with surveillance. Is like it's kind of everywhere. In most of the case, it's invisible. It's happening because we use tools, but we don't exactly know what these tools are gathering as data. It's there are a lot of digital surveillance systems that we don't even think they are there. Like internet service provider may track your behavior on the internet, and you have pretty much no way of knowing that. And the major difference with traditional surveillance is like it's very cheap. If we look at what was happening in the previous, like before, and like technologies and computers, one of the most, I would say, repressed and surveilled society in the modern time was like East Germany. And in East Germany, they had around one officer in the Stasi for 170 people, which is like a lot of work for one person. But in modern times, with this capacity of gathering data, we get into a situation where some organization like the NSA can actually gather information about everyone and have automated ways to analyze behavior and so on. So if you think about something to know, or I think that's an important concept in digital surveillance, one of them is called function creep. Function creep is this idea that you can have data or system built for one purpose, but actually they are going to be modified to be used for something else. And a clear example of that is geolocation of mobile phones. By design, to be able to use a mobile phone, you need to connect to an antenna through your telecom provider knows where you are. And that's just like how the system works. But actually, most of the telecom providers have found ways to use this data. So here's a screenshot from two internet service providers, telecom providers in France, Orange and SFR. And for instance, Orange is offering real-time tracking of crowds through this geolocation of data that are supposedly anonymized. On the right, you have another service where they offer some statistics to commerces and commerce area to know how many people are coming, from where they're coming, and like analysis of behaviors. And that's like when telecom providers started in, I guess, the 90s or the 80s with mobile phone, they were like, oh, cool, we're going to sell a service. We're going to have people pay to have access to the telecom like network and mobile phones. But now actually they have additional services based on the data they can collect about users. And that's a pretty common model in like all the services that exist today. Another important concept is that our data tells more about us than what we think at first. So you may be okay to share some data with a company saying like, well, it's not a big deal, right? But actually they can deduce a lot from that, and you may not have the idea at first. So an example of that's pretty interesting. Some years ago, I think 7 years ago, someone went on Reddit and asked, well, I'm checking the Fitbit of my wife, and I'm noticing that I think there's a problem with the hardware because the heartbeat rate has increased for several days. I think the Fitbit is broken. Discussion on Reddit turned out his wife was actually pregnant and they didn't know about it. And actually they realized that on Reddit and people were celebrating and everything, but it means you may be like, oh, I just want to know my heart rate, and Fitbit is able to deduce when you do sport, but also if you're pregnant, information you may not yourself be aware of. And another important concept I think about surveillance is the difference between data and metadata. Metadata is the content itself, and metadata is data about data. So classic example is a phone call. What you're going to say to your best friends is going to be the content of the conversation. So it's data. Metadata is going to be everything about that call. So who is calling who, what time, how long is it? And you may think it's not such a big deal, but actually it reveals a lot of information about us. First, it's quite easy to analyze. If you want to analyze phone calls of the entire Canadian population, you need to first get the audio calls, then have something that converted to text, and you need to understand what's happening. It's very context heavy, like how can you really interpret what people say? It can be very complex, and how to automate. But if you just have metadata, you can actually make graphs of who is speaking with who, and you have a complete view of like social graphs of people. And you can deduce a lot of things. Let's say someone called like an eye hospital, like me this week, because I have some eye issues, and then called the pharmacy, you have a pretty clear idea of like, okay, what's going on there. A famous call by the former director of the NSA. Actually, one journalist was in a debate with him, and he said pretty openly, well, we kill people based on metadata. And so in a lot of cases, you're going to see the difference between data and metadata. Don't underestimate the impact of metadata and surveillance. Okay, so we've been talking about, or I've been talking more about different forms of surveillance. The one that has been, I give several examples of them, is like corporate surveillance. And now a large part of today's surveillance actually done by a corporation in something that has been called surveillance capitalism by several writers, including Sushan Nazarboff in this very famous book. So surveillance capitalism is the idea of companies gathering as much private data as they can on people to generate profits. It has clearly started with Google. Google had pretty no idea at first how to make money until they realized that by making precise profile of people, they could sell targeted ads. And that's started kind of a race of the more data you get on people, the better you can sell targeted advertisements, the more money you can make. And once this first company was successful, other companies jumped on the wagon and were like, okay, let's do that. And now we get in the situation that most companies, instead of only selling a service or a product you're going to buy, they're also going to gather as much information as they can and try to make profit out of it. You could be reselling it. There is a whole economy of companies called data brokers. We talked about it this week that are like just gathering information on people and selling it. Could be targeted advertisement like Google and Facebook are doing. Now there is a whole race into training artificial intelligence algorithm. And for that, you need to have precise algorithm on people's behaviors. And so it has become like a large part of the new economy. And on the other hand, you have like the never-ending and very old government surveillance. It hasn't started, of course, with technology, but technology makes it way more efficient. I think especially in North America, I would say in the global north, a massive change in government surveillance has been 9/11. It created two things. One was making a focus on the war terror, which means not only surveilling states, but actually surveilling people, because anyone could be a terrorist, but also opened the door to like way more funding for NSA and other surveillance agencies, to a point that the NSA started to have this policy of pretty much collect it all. And as we have seen this week, I don't know if you were there for the workshop on FOIA, but like this RCMP training about how to avoid answering to FOIA requests. A pretty good example of the lack of oversight you have for most intelligence agencies. And the Snowden revelation in 2013 were a big example of that, about how much like a lot of the surveillance was illegal or questionably illegal, how much Americans didn't know about the surveillance, how much all the boundaries that were put about not surveillance American were not respected at all, and so on. And of course, public-private surveillance partnerships exist a lot in a lot of different ways. One of them, for instance, is public money being invested to fund private companies developing surveillance products. For instance, there is a whole ecosystem of company around the CIA to develop more efficient surveillance, but also turning corporate surveillance into government surveillance. And a very creepy example of this is revelation from 2020, where basically motherboard from Vice revealed that so there is an app called Muslim Pro for Muslim people to find the direction of the Mecca to pray. This app needs GPS location to find the direction, right? But it was actually gathering geolocation of all the users, and the company owning that without the user knowing, of course, was reselling that, and one of the customers was US Army. So you get into this complete broken system where people use apps, they don't know what data is used. Data is used gathered by a company with geolocation on millions of Muslims in the world, and is reselling that to the US Army. So it's a pretty good example of that. The FBI has actually used similar data, and it was a way for them to avoid getting a warrant. So again, lack of oversight and ways to get private information to people without getting any oversight. And one thing to finish in this like kind of creepy presentation of digital surveillance is I think it's very important to keep in mind that digital surveillance is rooted in existing systems of oppression, and surveillance is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and so on. Good example of that is, good example, if I can say, is like this screenshot of a Stockware website. Stockwares are spyware applications that are sold on the market openly, where you can basically buy them to spy on your wife to know if your wife is cheating. So clearly happening in context of both abusive relationship, domestic violence, and patriarchy. So this is the end of the landscape. I'm a bit sorry of I feel like add some drama to this afternoon. But I wanted to have some notions. If there is any question, feel free to raise your hand, jump in. A few words about the impact of digital surveillance. One of them that has been debated forever with digital surveillance is the question of chilling effects. Chilling effects mean that people, by knowing or feeling they're surveyed, are going to change their behaviors and censor themselves to avoid being surveyed or to avoid being at risk. There's been a very long debate to know how can you measure that, is it real or not. There is actually a Canadian academic who did a great paper, I think 3-4 years ago, where he analyzed number of visits on Wikipedia pages that could be seen as related to terrorism. And he found that the number of visits on these pages dropped a lot after the Snowden revelation. And so he attributed that to the chilling effect. People felt they would be surveilled and stopped visiting some web page on Wikipedia. And I mean, if you're like me, if you're like visiting any web page on radical Islamist group for just knowing what's happening, you have this thing about should I really do that right now, right? And I completely feel that. But more than that, I think there is a point to be made about how much digital surveillance completely goes against fundamental rights, but also fundamental roles in our society. I was speaking with a journalist a couple of weeks ago, but the question about how much can you be a journalist and actually do any journalist work if you cannot trust the security of your devices and you cannot even get in touch with sources without being sure that you can actually protect them if there is an issue. And I think that goes with this great quote from Barton Gellman about the fact that actually if we look at many advances we have in civil rights today, a lot of them came from illegal behaviors, right? I mean, there is the Underground Railroad. There is a question of, in France, a lot of people have been doing illegal abortion for centuries, and all that was illegal. How could that be possible in a society where there is full-blown digital surveillance and full control by the states? And so there is a question about, if you take the question of digital security or digital surveillance as a fight between the states and civil society, who is supposed to be a counterpower of the state, how can you be a counterpower if you cannot even have secure communication? And I think this is a way more political way to see digital surveillance than just looking at the right of privacy. And thanks, Alexei, for this quotes. Okay, now end of the drama, or kind of. But now we've talked about, this is a pretty bad situation. The whole weekend has been on a pretty dark tone. So I guess if you're in activism, that's there are not that many very good and positive news. But I've tried to make some thinking about how I've seen people working or how I've worked on countering digital surveillance and suggesting a very simple methodology. And then I will try to explain the Pegasus Project work we did based on that methodology, if I have time. So challenges, again, one is surveillance is invisible most of the time. It exists at the center of social norms, technical implementation, but also system of operation. So it's pretty complex to understand how digital surveillance exists. And it's hard to see the consequences of digital surveillance most of the time. So for instance, in my work, I've had a lot of journalists coming to me and being afraid because they were arrested at the border, for instance, and they thought that it was because their phone was hacked. But actually, it's very hard to make a clear link between surveillance and what's happening. If you have someone arrested at the border, was it because the last maybe article they published didn't please the government or the police? Was it just because the people at the border at that day had a bad day and wanted to just bother people? How can you make that link? And that's really challenging. So here's a very simple methodology that I think I've used a lot and I think works quite well. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but I will try to develop some ideas around it. First, you need to understand technology or this type of digital surveillance. Then you need to map it. So we go back to the question of mapping that's been at the center of this workshop, and then expose it. And here I think, even though it is quite challenging sometimes, I think the question of bringing art and not only reports and publication is really important. So first, understand it. Again, it's very complex, and I think, I would say especially technical people, but I want to blame tech people in general. But I feel like some people tend to have a very reductive view of how complex surveillance can be. And if you look at it, really, any form of surveillance, it's happening in very complex ecosystem. What's happening technically is a question, but also who is using surveillance, how, what's the economic structure behind, who is paying for what's the link between companies and the states. You get into some very complex form of surveillance, and often it's way more complex to know what's happening than just understanding the technical implementation of it. So, the core of it, and no big surprise here, but you really need multidisciplinary work, and you really need to have a mix of technical people, of course, but also activists, also social sciences. In my work, I've always found that social sciences is really often great to ask the right questions. And sometimes technology can find good answer, or you can have technical methodology to find good answers. And finally, you need to work with people affected by the surveillance. And I think, and we talked about it again, so I think if you were there for the mapping of eviction, how much if you are trying to make global views based on data without speaking with people affected, you can have a complete wrong vision of what's problem is. And I think that's really key. Map it, and the next question is, how do you get data about it? Because you want to end up with some form of mapping. We've done that the whole weekend, but it can be challenging. I think one thing that makes me liking this kind of work is you can find, often, not always, but you can often find a lot of information through technical analysis of the surveillance. You need to be creative. An example of that I'm going to mention, this is the great collective based in France called Exodus Privacy. If we come back to this question of trackers in a smartphone application, at some point they just ask the question, okay, which trackers exist for what? How can we find them and identify them? And what they developed is actually a pretty simple system technically with some fingerprints of third-party tools. And then they downloaded all the apps on Google Markets, and they just identified them in all the existing apps on the Play Store. And you can now, they have an app, you can download the app, check all the trackers on your application, and they're able to make statistics. For instance, Google Firebase Analytics, which is an analytics tool by Google, is in 59% of applications. And you can go for instance, this called Unity 3D Ads, which is an ads company. You can find that I think 11% of app on the Play Store are using it, and you can go into more details. And then if you want, you can pretty much see what this company is doing. You can go and analyze what the framework is, and you can do more information. You can get more information. Of course, FOIA requests, we talked about it so much this weekend. I won't say much more. EFF has used it, but again, if you don't get any answer, at least you have bothered to police. It's not lost, but you can often get some pretty decent answers. OSINT is a pretty weird military term that's used a lot for like open source intelligence, which means gathering information from online platform. But an example of that here is a journalist from OCRP used databases of shipments data. So you have databases that track containers that like sent from one company to another, one place to another place. And he found that Enso Group, which is a company who made Pegasus spyware, we'll talk more about it later, shipped a full container of hardware material to actually the Intelligence Bureau, which is an intelligence agency in India, in April 2017, which is actually a bit before we started to see the first usage of Pegasus in India. Again, it's a spoiler for later, but OSINT and gathering information online provide often some really useful data. And finally, there is more and more work done with leaked data. So, I mean, I don't know in which context you might have seen it in so many contexts. Russia, in the Russia-Ukraine wars, there's been so many companies and organizations hacked and data leaked. And so more and more people and journalists work on doing analysis based on leaked data. There is a great project, if you don't know it, there is a great journalist doing a project called DDoS Secrets, that is basically gathering a lot of data on leaked data and then making them available for researchers. Yeah, it's a great project, needed project that has received a lot of repression actually. As soon as it reached, they got a lot of repression when they started to republish data from the US police, if I'm right. And they definitely need more support than they have today. And finally, expose it. Once you have this vision of like, okay, here is what's happening, it's bad, people are affected, it has a lot of impact on human rights defender, activists, people in the streets, you need to expose it. And then again, especially after years working at Amnesty, you're like, let's publish a 40-page report with very detailed information about what law they are breaking. But I don't know if you have read any human rights reports, and if you haven't, you're lucky. It's great and needed, but it doesn't make people want to see change. And so, I mean, okay, a lot of things are better than long reports. You have like small video and other things, but I think part there is really important, both in the way to like gather people, but also make people feel the reality of surveillance. I found this great quote by Bertolt Brecht, but maybe I should stop having quotes every 2 slides. Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. I haven't made too many examples of art for digital surveillance. This one is one I liked in a couple of years ago. There was an exhibition in New York about privacy. And some people from an organization called Tactical Tech made a map of all the companies owned by Alphabet. So Alphabet is more the company of Google, if you know. And they made an art like this on the wall, where you have basically every pin is a company, and the size of the circle is the amount of budget, like the budget of the company. And so, and the color is the type of business they do. So you had like a lot of like advertisements. Of course, it's Google, but then I discovered that Google has some like companies making milking machines for cows. They also have a lot of like health companies. And when you gather all that under the realm of gathering as much data as you can, it gets pretty creepy. Okay, and once you have this methodology, I want to speak about 2 traps that are very common. Again, maybe more for technical people, but first one is techno-solutionism. So techno-solutionism has been once described by someone called Evgeny Morozov, where the idea is that when there are problems in society, we tend to find solution in technical applications. A lot of explanation of that in society, it's reduced everything to an individual issue. It's done with private funding, not public funding, it pushes startup and so on. So a lot of reasons why it's very common. But I think it's an issue we have in activist groups too. Mostly I would say coming from tech people, but because maybe that's my vision because I come from there. But also I feel there is a tendency for, even if people don't want to do that or realize the limitation of that, funders may be willing to fund that more than a 4-year project where you gather interviews of people and try to rate that. I mean, having an app that's going to solve all your problems, right? You have like street harassment, develop an app and then boom, problem solved. And guess what? It's not. So I think that's something to have in mind, how we are pushed to find technical solutions to social issues, and they rarely works. And the second one, I think I've been saying that 3 times in this talk, but it's the question of giving voice to people affected by surveillance. I mean, it's been weird to say that being in this room, but what I've seen in my work a lot is if you investigate digital surveillance, then you may have some cool findings, and then journalists can speak with you and say you're the cool hacker in town. You can speak about how complex it is. And you can do that being completely disconnected from the people who fear surveillance. And the most people who fear surveillance are people who are repressed, and a lot of personal privileges. So I think it's really important to speak about digital surveillance, or if you publish about surveillance, to give a voice to the people surveyed and why it's also surveyed. What were they fighting for when that happens? And I've quoted this great website, if you don't know it, called Beautiful Travel, which is a toolbox for activists. If you have not looked at the website, it's really great, where they have this principle of activism called give voices to those who can speak. Okay, so any question about this, or it has been quite broad? Okay, you can keep question for after if you want. So I'm going to enter into trying to explain this methodology and speaking about the work we have done at Amnesty International against Pegasus. I'm kind of sorry because it's one of the work where we don't have any good maps. And I'm like, then the whole week I've been about like maps, and I found one, but it's a terrible one, so I have to apologize. Well, first look at first step, understand the digital surveillance. So working on digital surveillance of activists started at Amnesty in 2017, when actually they realized that they were going to interview a lot of activists to speak about human rights issues. And many of them were actually hacked or had digital security issues. There is a report in Uzbekistan where there was an interview with several activists, and one of them got hacked, and her email got hacked. A lot of people she was speaking with in Uzbekistan got into a lot of trouble, had to leave the country. And so there was a kind of weird meeting between some people working on human rights and some tech people investigating digital surveillance. And that led to the creation of a team that I joined in 2019 that was multidisciplinary. We're about 8 to 10 people, with people working on technology. We're 4 technologists, people working in human rights, of course, people working in advocacy, people working on campaigns, lawyers, of course. And so that was the core of the discussion. We started with like, okay, we see that there is a problem. First, what is the problem, and what can we do against it? So let me talk a bit about the problem. The problem is not super great. It's not super new. So the first report really speaking about spyware attacks against activists was published in 2009. I think it started with investigations on spyware attacks against Tibetan NGOs in India. And so that was the beginning of a work done quite largely by the Citizen Lab in Toronto about like investigating phishing and spyware attack against activists and journalists. A lot of work was done against Tibetan NGOs in India because they had so much attacks, like so many attacks for years. I think it's the most documented case of state surveillance. But around 2012, one thing that emerged is that some countries didn't have the capacity to develop spyware, and they were buying them. And from 2012 to 2015, there was a few companies in Europe that were developing spyware and selling them to rich countries who didn't have a lot of tech skills, mostly in the Middle East. And these countries were using that the tools to target activists and journalists, like in this case, activists from Bahrain. There was an important change in 2016 with this report published by Citizen Lab. So this activist Ahmed Mansour from UAE, who is actually today in jail, and there is a lot of fear for his life. He received these two SMS. And if he had clicked on this SMS, his iPhone would have been compromised by a spyware called Pegasus. And so it was really new once because it was the first time an attack that was that advanced was found. So it's not about trying to convince you to install a program. It's really if you click on the link, your phone is compromised, and then everything from your phone can be monitored. So that was very hard to make, very expensive. The report was called the $1 Million Dissident. And the second aspect of it that was renewed was the first time there was publication about attacks by this company called NSO Group. And so NSO Group is an Israeli company. And around 2015, they kind of took over the market by selling spyware, officially to fight against crime and terrorism. And they were selling spyware only to states and spyware only for a smartphone, and we were able to hack into iPhones, which was quite challenging at that time, still is challenging. And so there was this company arriving and clearly leading these markets of spyware products for governments. In 2018, if I'm right, 2018, we discovered that an activist, a member of Amnesty International working on Saudi Arabia received an SMS. And actually, this SMS had a link that was also an attack with the Pegasus spyware. So if they had clicked on the link, their phone would have been compromised. And that actually in 2018 was the beginning of the work in the team to focus on NSO. And so when we had discussion about what to do, there are a few things. One is spyware leaves traces, and that's quite specific to spyware. If you speak about different forms of surveillance, like phone wiretapping, police may wiretap your phone calls, you have technically almost no way to know. But with spyware, you need to have something running on the phone, you need to have servers, you need to have domains, and all this leaves traces. So we decided to invest a lot of work in technical research to understand how spyware works, how Pegasus works, and how can we track it. But another thing we realized is, one is if you want to make impacts on spyware attacks, you need two things. Is one, you need to have, you need to be able to show who did the attack. If you have a report, and I've published some of this, like being like, oh, there was an attack against activists, really bad, but we don't know who that is. You have a pretty limited impact politically. So you need to have this attribution of attacks. And two, you need to have leverage into how can you make behavior change. If you want to call out states like Saudi Arabia for the bad behavior, you can, but it's unlikely they are going to change. But if you speak about companies, actually, companies there are a lot of pressure you can put on companies. And so we decided to focus on NSO Group because it was the leading companies, but also as a company, there is a way to have leverage and make some changes. And so the question we had was, how can we track NSO Group? How can we find NSO Group? And how can we find attacks? One thing is, okay, that's kind of spoiling because it's the end result of our work, but we started to, some of my colleagues started to analyze this domain they were using, and they use some pretty clever trick, what we call threat intelligence. It's like, basically you find one server used by NSO, and you're like, okay, are there other servers? And if you're able to find the one thing they use that no one else is using, then you can just search on the internet for other servers and be like, oh, actually, this one is also NSO, this one is also NSO. You need to get into pretty complex technical things about how servers are used and so on. But for instance, one of the things they had is that they were using websites, but the configuration of the websites, of how you connect to the website and the security of the website was so specific that their signatures was unique. And so one of my colleagues scanned the whole internet and was like, okay, who else is having that? And that way was able to find hundreds of domains that were related to NSO. And so when a lot of the work done, when I was showing SMS, was to link these domains to the first domains. Like we had the first attack, and we're like, okay, all these other domains are actually linked to these attacks. I think when we published this in 2021, we had 700 domains. So I can tell you to more details later if you want. I will skip some of them. Another question we had was, okay, are there traces of Pegasus attacks on phones? And so what we did was look at like, okay, how do you extract data from a phone? What kind of traces could it let? And it's kind of a cat and mouse game, because if you have a phone and you don't find anything, you don't know if you just don't know where to look at, or if you're just like having a phone that's not compromised. So until you have a phone that has been compromised and you have traces, you don't know exactly what you're looking at. So we had to go from like, okay, a phone that has been attacked, we found traces. Oh, another phone has been attacked, we found traces, and build like a methodology bit by bit. So I mean, it's a pretty boring screenshot, and it's command line because but basically it's an app that analyzes all the SMS of an iPhone, and it's going from like looking at every link in every SMS, and then it's like, oh, we know that's NSO, oh, that's NSO, that's NSO. They were using URL shorteners. I don't know if you know that, like, if you know what URL shorteners are, you have like short URL that redirect to long one. So we had something that automatically find URL shortener, find the long link, and so it's telling you, oh, this is actually short URL, but the URL behind is actually NSO group, or that kind of tools. Okay, that led us to work first in Morocco. In 2019, we published these reports with 2 human rights defenders from Morocco being targeted by NSO. Again, SMS with a link, and we were able to find that these links were all related to NSO. Then in 2020, we found that actually NSO was moving to more complex attacks. What we found in Morocco, we don't see it very well here. Can I remove that? Okay, I know it's better. What we call network injection attack. Network injection attack means that you have a box somewhere in the network, like computer system. And when the person targeted is just visiting a website, like the journalist was visiting yahoo.fr, the box is just like between you and the website and going to be like, no, you're going to visit this website instead. A lot of details about like how it can happen in problem security issues, but basically what it's doing is like it's forcing a visit to a malicious website. So you don't have to wait for people to click on the link. You don't have to hope they're going to click on the link from some unknown random people, and you just force their phone to visit the malicious website and to be compromised. This was one of the examples of attacks like this. NSO has been also using security issues in WhatsApp or other applications. And so from around 2018, 2019, they started to use what we call zero-click attacks. So it means that your phone can be compromised without any interaction with you. So before it was a link sent by SMS, if you click on it by mistake, boom, you're compromised. But from that point, 2018, 2019, they started to have attacks where they can hack your phone without you doing anything. So we're working with a consortium of journalists from 4 Million Stories. And at some point, we had access to a list of 50,000 phone numbers of people potentially targeted by Pegasus. And that was the beginning of the investigation of the Pegasus Project. The Pegasus Project was published in July 2021. It was a collaboration between, I think, 17 media, if I'm right, and Amnesty International as technical partner. And basically, on the basis of these 50,000 phone number, we did work to find people targeted, analyze their phone, and have evidence that some journalists and activists were compromised, targeted, or hacked by Pegasus. And then that some states were using Pegasus to target journalists and civil society. It was a lot of work on many different aspects. We had this list of 50,000 phone numbers, no name, nothing. So we had to be like, okay, who are these people? So that took a lot of work to find the names of people, confirm the phone numbers, and so on. Then we had to, journalists had to approach some of the people. Of course, there was a complete secrecy and paranoia. We had to do all this project under very strict security rules, like act as like any phone could have been compromised, but we worked and contacted many journalists, human rights defenders who were compromised when we spoke with them. So we couldn't tell them what was happening. We could approach some of them, telling them, hey, we may think you're under surveillance. Do you mind if we check your phone? Checking phones can be, we need access to some data. We need access to SMS, we need access to WhatsApp message to look for investigation. Some people didn't want to, and we couldn't reveal that. So it was a kind of like a wild hunt, actually in the middle of the pandemic, into trying to connect with as many people as possible, check their phones, limit as much as possible what you can say, and so on. Yes. So we got this list of phone number, contacted people, started to check their phone, and that's actually where we developed most of the methodology. So we had the role of like developing the methodology and checking phones. And like one thing that I think it's hard to guess is like we spent years working with journalists, working with activists, and trying to be like, okay, who is targeted by Pegasus? We went to some countries where we thought Pegasus were there, connected with like top-notch journalists, and like nothing. With these lists, so we're only able to find traces of Pegasus on iPhones for different technical reasons. If we only look people who had iPhone in this list that we checked and they still had a phone, didn't change or reset the phone, 95% of them had traces of Pegasus on their phone. So we were in a situation that we had a few cases over several years, and suddenly it was raining people compromised. It was like one person compromised, another person compromised. We found traces of Pegasus on 37 phones in the process of this investigation. Okay, this is a map. It's not a great map, but this is a map. So we publish about 11 states who abused Pegasus. So some of them made more noise than others. Of course, less people care about Kazakhstan, sadly, but like Mexico, the context of repression against journalists. We did a lot of work on Morocco, in France, some major journalists, French journalists were targeted, for instance. Togo, Rwanda, UAE, Saudi Arabia. People close to Jamal Khashoggi, for instance, were hacked before and after he was killed. India, in the context of repression, existing repression against journalists. So yeah, Hungary, actually a very, very cool story of that is Direct 36 is a Hungarian media who were partner in the Pegasus project. And they became partner because they were contacted by the consortium because journalists were on the list. We checked their phone, they were hacked, and then they joined the investigation and actually did incredible work at covering the context of Pegasus in Hungary. Yeah, India. I think one thing that was important is like for a long period of time, this question of spyware was seen as like, oh, this is like a Middle East issue. And there was a thing, especially from the global north, to be like, oh, it is like part of the Middle East where there are a lot of human rights issues. But suddenly, Hungary, and then later it was revealed that Poland, Spain, Greece have actually used Pegasus, or Greece are using another spyware. And so it became a way more worldwide, worldwide question, which is kind of sad that you have to have something closer to your country. But like suddenly in Europe, people started to react more to that. Okay, expose it. So then the question, how do you expose that? So in the Pegasus project, we have had, we published small reports. We didn't do like full-blown, or we did one full-blown Amnesty report. But we had one big advantage, like journalists were publishing their own stories. And I've seen such a difference between when you're an NGO trying to convince journalists to cover a topic versus when a journalist is convinced and their story and they want to cover it. And I've seen like, I did a bit of media work at that time, and I was like, you're like on radio, pretty big show, quite dense. And I was like stressed to have like hours of preparation. And I was a journalist who was home. He was like, you know what, this morning I was talking with my kids. I'm like, who are you? And the reason really I was impressed by the capacity of journalists to speak in the media in a very different way. And that really helped also to gather the message. And journalists did a lot of work to carry the message, explain what is Pegasus. But it's been really a challenge for years about how do you raise an issue before there was so much attention? How do you raise attention on an issue where it's not mass surveillance, not everyone is targeted? A lot of examples we had were in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, where it's hard to make any kind of like campaigns there because of the the ecosystem, it's hard to raise any attention because, like, you know, I had a journalist, like, I published a report with Uzbekistan in 2018, report with lower media coverage in equal Amnesty report this year. And a journalist pretty much telling me, openly, oh yeah, no one cares about Uzbekistan. And you get in this pretty, like, history that you have seen, depending on who is targeted, you have very different media coverage. A couple of examples that I think were interesting. One of my colleagues, Claudio Gornet, in 2016-17, did some work to do 3D visualization of spyware. So, I mean, it's supposed to turn, but got lost in the PDF. But basically, he took like files, like spyware, the code of some spyware, and he tried to make a representation in 3D where the color of every block, it depends on the value of the file. Does that make sense? And he was like being like, okay, this is a spyware that targeted an activist in Pakistan as a way to make it visible, as like this thing that you cannot see really, make it like, okay, here is how we can see something, and make like, I think in an art exhibition, something like 5 or 10 example of that with each time the spyware and who was targeted. That was a Pakistani activist. So we worked with Forensic Architecture, which is an organization based out of the UK, and Citizen Lab in 2021. I think it was right before the Pegasus Project. And they published this platform with like 3D visualization. Can I skip that? Okay, here is a 3D visualization of a lot of data where you have, can I show it? Okay, I'm trying to show it. You have like, here you have the year. Okay, it's not really clear. Well, it's digitalviolence.org. Here you have the year, and here you have the country, and they map different kind of things. They mapped people being hacked based on data that we had. They mapped publication about surveillance, but they also mapped, which I think is really interesting, repression against these activists. So some activists, for instance, in Azerbaijan, that we know were hacked, they mapped all the repression they had by the states before and after that. And I think it's, I mean, it's a bit messy to hear there. You can play with it on the website, but it's also very important to map the fact that there is a clear link between the digital surveillance and the repression there is, and these are not happening disconnected. Okay, some conclusions. So I have focused a lot on Pegasus. I think this work on spyware, I mean, I spent a lot of time on that, and a lot of people have been working on that. I think on this topic and on the topic generally of digital surveillance, when I started working on that, I would say it's 10 years ago, it was quite rough in the way that you didn't have a lot of journalists, you didn't have a lot of organizations focusing on that. And so it was hard to develop networks. It was hard to find people who would get it. You'd find a lot of like, it was really the time where like you'd see journalists covering that and you're like, oh, please no, like read, like people would not instruct journalists because they were like completely missing the points. And this has really changed. I mean, on spyware, a lot of NGOs are getting on board, but if you look at a lot of questions about digital surveillance, there are like great organization right now. A lot of activists with strong skills on that, journalists covering that who are top notch. And I think this has been a really important change over the last 10 years. And I think, I mean, it's going to be one of the next struggle. And it's not just like they're all linked with like, right, the development of capitalism, the development of like authoritarianism, and all this is of course connected. But I think we're in a much better place to see like really organizations who are like, have a lot of knowledge and have like real creativity and skills to challenge the power of the question of surveillance. So yeah. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'm going to finish with a quote. I'm going to use the last one, I swear. Pretty famous, but like if you have not heard it, I really like it. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. By Lila Watson, who is a strange activist, and I think in the context of digital surveillance, is I think again, I mean say it again, but like digital surveillance doesn't happen disconnected from struggle. If you work on digital surveillance, you have to work with the people struggling with the civil rights liberation fights. They're always connected. They're never happening in vacuum. And so when you see Pegasus and like Palestinian activists being targeted, activists for the liberation of Western Sahara, people fighting for like journalists in Mexico, people fighting freedom of the press in Morocco, there are like all these surveillance happening very specific context that needs some more attention.